The courtroom was tense. All eyes were on the young black woman standing confidently at the defendant's table. Judge Charles Hargrove leaned forward, staring her down. His voice dripped with condescension. "This is a court of law," he sneered, "not a church. You think you're above the rules?" The crowd chuckled, whispered, smirked. But her? She didn't blink, didn't flinch. Because what happened next? It would turn this trial upside down. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy. It started with a phone call. Savannah was sitting at her desk in the White House press office, scrolling through the day's agenda, when her phone buzzed. The president's office. She answered immediately. "There's a case happening in the D.C. courthouse," came the deep voice on the other end. "A Christian group is fighting for their right to pray in public. I need you to go observe." Savannah didn't hesitate. She understood the weight of that request. At just 27 years old, she had already made history, the youngest White House press secretary ever appointed. She had faced tough press briefings, handled political storms, and stood firm under pressure. Born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, Savannah had grown up watching her mother, civil rights attorney, fight for justice. Faith, resilience, and knowing the law better than anyone in the room were in her blood. So she grabbed her navy blazer, adjusted the silver cross around her neck, and headed straight to the courthouse. She thought she was just there to observe, but within the hour, she would become the center of the trial. And the judge? He had no idea who he was dealing with. Savannah walked into the D.C. courthouse, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor. She had been in plenty of courtrooms before, both as an observer and a legal analyst, but today was different. The courtroom was packed. Dozens of people sat on the wooden benches, whispering in hushed tones as they waited for their cases to be heard. Some were here for minor infractions, others for small claims disputes. Savannah slid into a seat in the middle row, pulling out a notebook and pen. She was here to observe, not interfere, but her instincts told her to stay sharp. At the front of the room, a bailiff stood stiffly near the judge's bench. The energy shifted as the large wooden doors behind the bench swung open. Judge Charles Hargrove entered. The room fell silent. At 62 years old, Hargrove had been a federal judge for nearly 3 decades. He was known for his zero tolerance, no-nonsense rulings. A man who ran his courtroom with absolute authority. His sharp grey eyes swept the room, scanning the crowd with a look of mild disinterest. He adjusted his robe, sat down, and flipped through a stack of documents. "Let's begin." The first case was called. A man in a flashy gold "I Am King" t-shirt stepped forward. "Your Honor," the man said, adjusting his belt, "it was just a parking ticket. I already paid it online." "Dismissed," the judge said without looking up. The man grinned, nodding in appreciation as he left. Next, a woman with oversized gold hoop earrings and long red nails approached. She wore a bright pink fur coat, adjusting her sunglasses as she spoke. "Your Honor, my landlord says I didn't pay rent, but I did. Pay the balance or vacate in 30 days. Judge Hargrove said flatly, stamping the paper in front of him. Savannah narrowed her eyes. It was all moving fast, too fast. No one was given time to argue. No discussion, no nuance, just a verdict and a dismissal. Savannah had been quietly jotting down notes, listening closely, but when she shifted slightly in her seat, her silver cross necklace caught the light. Judge Hargrove froze. His expression changed, eyes narrowing, his lips pressing into a thin line. He flipped through his documents again, then looked up. His stare was cold, piercing. Then, in a voice that carried through the courtroom, he spoke. "Miss, that cross doesn't belong here." A wave of silence swept the room. People turned their heads. The man sitting next to Savannah stiffened, and a woman in the back let out a soft gasp. Savannah blinked, shifting her attention from her notes to the judge. "Excuse me?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. Judge Hargrove's jaw tightened. "This is a federal courtroom," he said, tapping his gavel lightly against the bench. "Religious symbols have no place here. Remove it or step outside." Savannah's grip tightened around her pen. The energy in the room changed. For the first time that day, the judge wasn't just rushing through cases. He had stopped because of her. And she knew without a doubt this wasn't about courtroom rules. This was about power, and she wasn't about to back down. Savannah didn't move. The air in the courtroom was heavy, thick with silence. The judge's words hung in the air like a challenge, daring her to react. But she didn't flinch, didn't blink. Slowly, she lifted her chin and spoke, her voice calm but firm. "I am here on official duty, Your Honor," she said, her tone measured. "My cross is a personal item. It is protected by the First Amendment." A few whispers spread through the crowd. A man in the back folded his arms, nodding slightly. Judge Hargrove smirked. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his gavel lazily against the bench. "Not in my courtroom," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. Then his smirk disappeared. "Step up to the bench." The courtroom gasped. People turned to each other, murmuring. A few reporters reached for their phones, sneaking recordings despite the strict no-filming policy. Savannah exhaled slowly, keeping her posture straight as she rose from her seat. She walked with steady, deliberate steps, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she approached the judge's bench. Her face was unreadable. Judge Hargrove picked up a slip of paper from his desk, holding it up between two fingers. His gaze was smug. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, tilting his head. Savannah's eyes flickered to the document. "It's a contempt fine," he continued, waving it slightly before setting it on his desk. $500. Pay it today." The room erupted in gasps. The jury shifted uncomfortably. Even some of the court staff exchanged glances, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Savannah kept her expression neutral, but inside she felt a fire ignite. She let the moment stretch before speaking. "Your Honor," she said, tilting her head slightly, "just so I'm clear, me cross is a problem. But the man with the I Am King t-shirt was fine." A few chuckles rippled through the audience. Judge Hargrove's smirk twitched. "You are in contempt, miss," he said, slamming his gavel once. Savannah folded her hands in front of her, completely unshaken. "Respectfully, sir," she said, her voice unwavering. "I believe you just violated my constitutional rights." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Hargrove stiffened, his eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. But Savannah wasn't finished, and I'd like that noted in the record. A murmur swept through the crowd, because for the first time in years, someone had challenged the judge in his own courtroom, and he didn't like it. Savannah could feel the heat of the moment pressing down on her, but she didn't show it. She stood at the judge's bench, her expression cool, collected. But under the table, her thumb subtly tapped her phone screen. The recording started. "Sir," she said, her voice steady, "may I ask, why am I fined? But not the man with the printed t-shirt, or the woman with the oversized jewelry?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge's expression darkened. "Don't change the subject," he snapped, gripping his gavel tighter. Savannah tilted her head slightly. "I'm not," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "I'm proving that this isn't about courtroom rules. It's about religious discrimination." The tension peaked. The crowd watched closely, realizing she had a point. Judge Hargrove's face turned a shade redder, his jaw tightening. "Miss, this is my courtroom," he hissed. "You do not make the rules here, I do." Savannah folded her arms, standing her ground. "I never said I made the rules," she replied smoothly. "I'm just pointing out that they only seem to apply when it's convenient for you." A few people in the gallery exchanged wide-eyed glances. The judge's gavel slammed down hard. "Enough!" He turned to the bailiff. "Take her phone," he ordered. The room gasped. The bailiff hesitated for a fraction of a second. Savannah didn't move. "Are you really going to confiscate my personal property without cause, Your Honor?" she asked. her tone laced with quiet challenge. The judge flinched because he knew she was right. The jury shifted uncomfortably. Even the court clerk, an older woman with sharp eyes, lowered her pen slightly. They all knew what was happening. Savannah wasn't being punished for breaking a rule. She was being punished for standing her ground. The courtroom was waiting, watching to see what happened next. Judge Hargrove exhaled sharply and leaned forward. "You want to play lawyer, miss?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Fine. Let's see how well you handle the consequences." Savannah didn't blink, because deep down she knew he had just made his biggest mistake. Savannah took a slow, steady breath. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the entire courtroom hanging on what would happen next. Judge Hargrove was still fuming, his hands gripping the edges of his bench, but there was something else in his expression now. Frustration, unease, because for the first time he wasn't the one in control. Savannah reached into a blazer pocket and pulled out a slim leather case. With a smooth motion, she flipped it open and held it up for the courtroom to see. A White House ID badge. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The judge visibly flinched. Savannah's expression didn't change. "You see, Your Honor," she said, her voice smooth but firm, "I don't just talk for a living. I know the law." The room fell deathly silent. Savannah took a step forward, never breaking eye contact with the judge. "Let's talk about precedent, shall we?" she said, flipping open her notebook. She ran her finger down a highlighted section and read aloud. "Church of Lukumi Babalu, IV City of Hialeah, 1993. A few attorneys in the crowd stiffened. Reporters scribbled furiously. The jury leaned in. This Supreme Court case ruled that targeting religious practices or religious symbols violates the First Amendment. She paused for effect, then continued. The government, meaning any public office, including this courtroom, cannot restrict religious expression unless there is a clear, compelling state interest. And even then, it must be applied equally to all. She tilted her head slightly. "Tell me, Your Honor, was there a compelling state interest in fining me for my cross, but letting a man in a 'I am King' t-shirt walk free?" The room murmured. The judge clenched his jaw. Savannah stepped forward, placing her White House ID firmly on the desk in front of him. "This fine?" she said, tapping the contempt slip. "It's illegal." The jury gasped. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly looking less confident. A few people in the audience whispered, heads nodding. Even the bailiff, who had been standing stiffly by the wall, glanced at the judge uncertainly. Savannah let the silence stretch. Then she smiled slightly, but there was no amusement in her expression, only certainty. "And this courtroom," she said, her voice calm but cutting, "is about to learn what happens when the law is ignored." Judge Hargrove said nothing, because for the first time in his career, he was the one who had been outmatched. For a long moment, Judge Hargrove said nothing. His fingers curled around his gavel, knuckles white, his jaw tight as if he was trying to suppress his anger. Savannah held his gaze, completely unfazed. The courtroom wasn't on his side anymore, and she knew it. Slowly, she reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone and pressed play. The recording echoed through the silent courtroom. First, there was the murmur of the crowd. Then, the judge's voice, cold, authoritative, undeniable. "You're the only one bold enough to bring a religious symbol here." The reaction was instant. A gasp rippled through the room. A few people covered their mouths. The reporters sprang into action, fingers flying over their phones. Some typed furiously, others raised cameras, capturing every second. The jury exchanged stunned glances. And then, slowly, the bailiff, James Wilson, crossed his arms. He had seen enough. Judge Hargrove's face turned pale, his once certain demeanor cracking under the weight of his own words. He slammed his gavel down. "Turn that off!" he barked. "This is my courtroom!" Savannah didn't flinch. "No, Your Honor," she said coolly. slipping her phone back into her blazer. "This is the people's courtroom, and the people just heard the truth." More whispers, more murmurs. The prosecutor cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. He looked away, clearly uncomfortable. Judge Hargrove exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. He was cornered, and he knew it. Savannah took a slow step forward. "Your Honor," she said, her tone measured, "you didn't find me for breaking a rule. You find me because of my faith." The words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. Judge Hargrove's lips pressed into a thin line. The jury looked at him now, not as a judge, but as a man who had just been exposed. The bailiff narrowed his eyes, standing a little taller. Reporters continued tweeting, recording, whispering. The whole world was watching. And in that moment, Judge Hargrove wasn't the one in control anymore. He was on trial now. The courtroom was no longer just a room. It was a national spectacle. The moment Savannah exposed the judge's bias, the internet caught fire. Within minutes, Number Cross in Court was trending #1 worldwide on X, formerly Twitter. Fox News breaking headline: White House press secretary humiliates judge in religious bias case. Conservative influencers posted clips of the trial. "This is what happens when you know your rights. Savannah just schooled the system." A liberal commentators debated. Did the judge overstep his power, or was this just a misunderstanding? Then, the biggest moment, the president tweets, "She just schooled the legal system. Religious freedom matters." The tweet exploded, gaining over 1 million likes in minutes. Trump supporters, legal experts, and faith groups rallied behind Savannah. But it wasn't just Twitter. CNN, Mississippi NBC, and Fox all aired breaking news segments. D.C. judge under fire after targeting religious symbol in court. The D.C. Judicial Council launched an immediate investigation. A public statement was issued. Judge Charles Hargrove is now under review for possible ethics violations. A full investigation is underway. The judge's office received thousands of emails and calls. Some people demanded his resignation. Others called for a formal apology to Savannah. Inside the courthouse, Judge Hargrove sat frozen. His face, once filled with authority, was now pale. He wasn't the one handing down judgments anymore. Now, he was the one being judged. The D.C. Judicial Council wasted no time. Within 24 hours, a formal hearing was announced. Judge Charles Hargrove was summoned to defend himself, but deep down, he knew it was over. The video had spread too far. The internet had spoken. The law was clear. 3 days later, the verdict came in. Breaking news: Judge Charles Hargrove resigns amid religious bias controversy. The fallout wasn't just personal, it was systemic. Under public pressure, congressional leaders and legal experts reviewed policies on religious freedom in courtrooms. New judicial guidelines were announced. No judge can ban religious symbols without clear legal justification. All contempt fines related to religious expression must be reviewed by an ethics board. Every courtroom in the U.S. must adhere to federal religious freedom protections. A legal precedent had been set. And Savannah? She wasn't just the woman who won a case. She was the woman who changed the system. A week later, Savannah stood at the White House podium. The press room was packed. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned forward, ready to hear her statement. Savannah took a deep breath and faced the nation. "Yesterday, I was fined for my faith." She paused, letting the words settle. "Today, we've changed the system." The room erupted in applause. The moment was historic. This wasn't just about her cross. This was about every person in America who had ever been told to hide their faith. Savannah stood tall, knowing this was only the beginning. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Hargrove sat in his office, staring blankly at the television screen. Every news channel replayed his downfall. His once feared courtroom now a symbol of judicial overreach. His career? Gone. He had spent decades passing judgment on others. Now the world had passed judgment on him. and there was nothing he could do to change it. She just won this battle, but the fight for freedom never stops. If you loved watching, make sure to subscribe. More stories of truth, power, and justice are coming your way. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss a single moment, because this is just the beginning.